Hi, this is Gabe Ignetti, and this is the Ecomodernist Soapbox. We have with us today an activist for nuclear power and for the climate named Karl Pauls, and I've known him for a while, and though we've never met personally, that's how it is in this new world of ours, but he's a great guy, and we're working on something called the Ecomodernist Society. They have one in Europe, they have one in Finland, and they are trying to start some, I think, in the Netherlands, I believe. So we're trying to put some stuff together. We're trying to get things real. So how you doing, Karl?
Oh, pretty good, Gabe. Well, I'm in Seattle, so we're on lockdown. But other than that, I get to work from home. I put a lot of time in cleaning my office and also spending a lot of time with my family.
Yeah. Be careful out there.
Trying my best.
You know, it seems to me from knowing you that we've been on the same page for quite a while as far as activism goes. I mean, I believe that we both came out of the climate change movement, and I know personally that it was when I learned about the necessity of nuclear power that brought me over to being a nuclear activist, even more than a climate activist, because that's got to be front and center.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been sort of on the periphery of the climate movement. And ever since Al Gore lost, it was going downhill fast. We got into oil, we got fracking going, and man, the energy output from fossil fuels has been skyrocketing ever since Bush 2 came into the White House. And so that's sort of where we're at. And then I got the thorium bug, I got really excited, and I got more excited when I found out all of the awesome nuclear companies we have around Seattle and Western Canada. It's just amazing.
I'm seeing us moving into a Star Trek future, slowly but surely.
Yeah, it's like we're founding Starfleet here in Seattle instead of San Francisco.
Yeah, but that Star Trek future is not a given. We're in a crossroads. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you can see with this coronavirus, I mean, it's just one example. I mean, modernity is this race between progress and chaos. And just being bunched together in cities and having the ability to travel to other countries so quickly. I mean, we're so interconnected. But there's one thing that is a silver lining with this coronavirus, and that's that we've learned, I hope, that short-term thinking is not the way to go, and normalcy bias is something that hopefully is a thing of the past. And that should hopefully move over to our attitudes towards climate change as well and climate activism. I know so many replies to calls for climate action have been accusations of alarmism. And when an alarm really is going off, if you really look at it, and this is really a wake-up call.
We really need to be prepared for new threats. I've gotten a little bit of education about the coronavirus from the great organization in Washington called Vaccinate Washington, and they're a pro-medicine, pro-vaccination group who has been fighting against the so-called vaccine choice or the parental rights movement that has been trying to roll back legislation in Washington that any public school you need to be fully vaccinated. And the parental choice or the anti-vax campaigners are really pushing back, and Vaccinate Washington is a wonderful resource. Now, to get back to coronavirus, from what I understand, the normal coronavirus, that's existed for decades or eons, does mutate. I'm not personally knowledgeable about how quickly or slowly, but we need to be very careful to be prepared for when these novel mutations occurred so that we can target those parts of the disease, the virus organism, that make it especially deadly to humans. And so we're sort of cutting off each of these little protein chain attacks, and we're kind of attacking its arms. We're attacking all of the weapons that it has to hurt human beings. We're looking for its lethal potential, not just, oh, you're a virus.
We have made progress with medicines for this, it seems, but none of the naturopathic medicines, I might add. My guess here, too, is that we would have been far ahead of the curve if we had funded the CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, much more strongly. I mean, the amount of money that's been put into these has been a joke, in spite of the fact that we knew a pandemic was inevitable. I mean, I remember back in the 80s, I believe, there was a movie, I think, called Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman. It was a B movie. And they said there was more money spent on that movie than was spent on the CDC. I mean, it's just pitiful. It's a joke. I mean, it's really ridiculous because any pandemic is much more of a major threat to our nation than the threat of being invaded by any foreign country, which is really impossible. The only thing that could get us is germs. And we spend trillions on defense. Nothing was done by people to demand that these agencies be funded the way they should be, even though the threat is every bit as dangerous as climate change and far more immediate. As far as I'm concerned, ecomodernism would be necessary and an imperative, even if there was no such thing as nuclear power, because all of these threats are imperative as well. We just never thought of it that way, but it's true. And we could go right down the list. And by the way, this gives us the opportunity to build coalitions to help advance support for nuclear power. It's one hand washing the other. That's how politics works. And not only that, but ecomodernism provides that futuristic vision that we were talking about that motivates and inspires people to, and I'd have to admit that it perplexes me and frustrates me as to why ecomodernism hasn't caught on more.
Yeah, I kind of feel the frustration. I know that there are some people in the nuclear movement who have been here for a very long time, and I respect the work that they do. They don't necessarily look for the same opportunities to grow the eco-modernist or the pro-nuclear futurist perspective. And I think that we can be standout in that way. And we can sort of build our army of eco-modernists who are also going to be pro-nuclear. Whereas the traditional nuclear community might be very focused on national security and they might be very focused on other topics, we are going to be here looking for, just in general, solutions for the future of humanity, to have this next generation Star Trek future to greet all of humanity in the next century.
Oh, yes. And speaking of that Star Trek future, I think we need to expand the space program as well. This whole idea that we need to solve our problems on Earth before we go into space has been just bogus. I mean, we're always going to have problems on Earth. And the space program has always helped to solve them. Dr. Stephen Hawking once said that our problems cannot be solved on this Earth unless we move into space. And another area, too, I'd like to talk about here is GMOs, which have been vital to adapting our crops and even our environment to climate change. And I might add that opposition to the GMO mosquito must end, especially in light of the role that mosquitoes play as a disease vector. The dangers here are completely imaginary. We need to exponentially expand the GMO mosquito program across the United States to fight this coronavirus.
And GMOs is especially interesting to me. I spent a few years working IT for a organization that is at the front lines of crop research. That's the Washington State University Crop and Soil Sciences. These plants are safe for human consumption. And yeah, I've been pro-GMO since I sat down with the director of the department, and I was making sure that I understood everything there was to know about GMOs and how much the people that were sending me these dumb forwards about how pig genes were going to get into your system because of the GMOs, just how wrong that attitude was.
Oh, yeah. And the real problem here is that we get caught up in these ideologies, which is really another way of saying tribalism. I mean, being part of the group. But that don't work in this modern age. So we got to get out of our boxes. We got to get rid of our confirmation bias. I mean, people don't really think. Jesus is just reading from a script, and they're defending that script like lawyers rather than thinking like scientists.
Yeah, you know who the good guys and the bad guys are, and that's who you're going to advocate for. And it takes a lot to knock them off that. But we're scientists. We need to look for the evidence and then make up our mind. Human beings need to be judges, not lawyers. I really like that analogy, Gabe.
It's often become so counterproductive what they do, because rather than basing their activism on solid science, they've got completely caught up in junk. I mean, the root of this problem that we face with the environmental movement, and it's not just in their opposition to nuclear power or the space program or GMOs or you name it, it's all of these things. The root is their blind acceptance of the appeal to nature fallacy. I hope I said that right.
That is the right one, yeah. It's the idealization or the worship of nature. Like, people criticize people who worship science, like, okay, I read it in a textbook, so it must be true, and that's scientism, where, oh, this fascinating way that things are supposed to work, and the worship of the mechanics is scientism, whereas if you're an actual scientist, you accept evidence and reproducibility, and then the worship of nature, how it was before it was touched by human hands, must be best. And that's not what most people think it is. It's not a golf course. It's a pile of mud and a wild field.
True. With all its faults, we still need to put a check on environmental destruction and to demand climate action. And without our involvement, the solutions that the environmental movement offers will send us into a destructive wormhole. Being involved is our only chance of turning this around. And there's nothing like one-on-one bonding to be able to convince people. You really can't do it very well over the internet in a virtual space. You need that personal contact. And we also need to earn the respect of environmentalism, not just by our words, but by our actions. And that's the key to winning this fight. That's why I admire your work, by the way. And I'd like for you to tell us a little more about that work that you do in the environmental movement.
Well, about 2.5 or 3 years ago, I got involved with 350 Seattle after I told them, hey, there's this clean energy conference that a bunch of our local energy folks are going to, and they're sponsored by natural gas. And look, my representative is going to go talk at this conference where they're all happy about natural gas. And I don't think that's right. It still increases the CO2 in the atmosphere, and the methane leakage is also a problem. And we did a little bit of projection activism. We protested, and we put a big projection on the side of a building right next to the conference that said no LNG in Tacoma. And this is how I got involved with the protest against this LNG tank that they put on tribal lands in Tacoma, Washington, without local consent. And of course, there's some tall claims about how dangerous it is or how destructive it is. They're saying things like the whole thing could explode. Well, that's not true. What is true is that they're not going to have a way of containing the liquefied natural gas when it spills. And there's definitely some problems in that. And definitely I'm conflicted about what is the right decision to allow more natural gas production and infrastructure or to prohibit it. I thought it was a good way of building power, of getting involved with a local environmental group. And so I've joined 350 Seattle, Extinction Rebellion, the Democratic Socialists of America in Seattle, a bunch of different organizations, and really talked to all of them and gotten to know them and gotten deeply involved. And unfortunately, I was not as astute and not as attentive on some policy decision that they made. And shortly after I got involved, 350 Seattle and 350 Bellevue signed the Friends of the Earth anti-nuclear demand letter for the Green New Deal.
Oh, that's the craziest letter I've ever read. I mean, tell us a little more about this.
Right, and so this was around the end of 2018 when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just won her election, I believe, and she was getting a lot of people excited about Sunrise and what we were going to do to make a New Deal, a Green New Deal, to create thousands of jobs, to create a whole bunch of clean energy, to create an equitable transition to this clean energy future. And so what happened? Friends of the Earth got involved and they said, well, we know exactly the way you should go. They came in and there's like, here's our vision. We have put this in front of all these groups and they said yes. And you know how they do that? They find the leadership. They provide a hard sell. They say, here is our demand for the Green New Deal. And by signing this, you are going to be telling everyone that you support the Green New Deal. And they don't mean the AOC, the Markey Green New Deal. They meant the Friends of the Earth Green New Deal. And you saw this happen where the media reported 622 organizations sign a letter demanding a Green New Deal, but it wasn't the Green New Deal. It was a watered-down anti-nuclear, anti-carbon sequestration, anti-carbon tax deal. It was a fake Green New Deal. Then they tricked the media into that.
Yeah, I've been involved in 350 as well. I mean, I'm actually on the board of 350 South Florida. And when this letter came out, I mean, I read this and I was just shaking my head and I brought it to the board and they didn't know a darn thing about it. And I even tried to, in vain, to get them to oppose it, but they didn't want to make waves. So, and when I thought about it, what I did decide to do is to approach Karl and I said, listen, we have got to have our own organization because I've had experience talking with the larger leadership of the 350 organization. And, you know, if you broach the idea that nuclear might not be as bad as they think, you might as well be talking about chopping up babies and eating them. It's just ridiculous. And there are a lot of pro-nuclear people in 350 and in these environmental organizations. I've spoken to them, I've seen them. But the thing is, they are afraid of even bringing it up. And the way they feel is that, well, yes, it's important to have nuclear, but we still need to make demands that more decisive action be taken. And they're right, because nuclear is not the only thing, by the way. There's other issues as well, but nuclear is the most important. And what they don't realize is, I believe, is that renewables are so weak in comparison to nuclear power, and it can't be done without nuclear power. And I think that's too why we need to bring them over, because that's the only way we could pull their coat on that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there are people in Seattle who are pro-nuclear, who are involved in the environmental movement, and they will not speak a word because they don't want the label. I've decided I'm going to be that person. I'm going to speak up whenever it's appropriate. I'm just going to raise my voice and say, well, if we don't build this LNG tank, where are we going to get the energy from? If we tear down 3 gigawatts of lower Snake River dams, where's the energy coming from? I have an answer for you. It's building more NuScale plants out there in Richland, Washington. It's supporting our nuclear plant rather than asking them to audit the health effects of nuclear, which 350 Seattle has done.
Yeah, unfortunately, as far as I could see, I don't think there's any ecological organizations that are not anti-nuclear. Aside from the CCL, there's nobody that's even neutral on this as far as I know, and not even on the left as far as I know.
There's a few, and we're working on them.
And even if they're neutral, it's okay. I'm not looking for these organizations, and I don't think we should be looking for these organizations to all of a sudden become pro-nuclear. I mean, you'd lose most of the membership. They need to have a coalition because fighting climate change is important. It was that mass murderer, Joe Stalin, who once so rightfully said it's not a good thing to get too far ahead of the masses. And I would speak to those of our brethren who are pro-nuclear, who see renewables as just being the seventh circle of hell, just terrible. I don't think we should be that extreme, and I don't think we should be put off by working with environmentalists who don't support nuclear power. Because you could make all the greatest arguments about how nuclear is hands down superior from all the other renewable technologies, but it does not take into account the whole picture. We have a climate crisis, and we need to be moving as swiftly as possible to decarbonize by any means necessary. We're in a race against time.
Yeah, and it's useful to talk about renewables as a sometimes energy. If you try to live on renewables, you're not really going to have your needs met. Unless you're talking hydro and you're in a wonderfully hydro-rich society like Washington or Scandinavia or Uruguay, out of some very specific situations, you need nuclear to have a carbon-free economy.
Yeah, and you still got the NIMBY problem. A lot of areas, people refuse to have a nuclear plant put up. We still have a climate crisis, so in that context, it's still a good thing if they put up a solar farm or a wind farm to decarbonize.
Yeah, and that's the only reason that I'm really in favor of building wind in Washington is that it will keep some natural gas in the ground. It will keep that demand a little bit lower than it has been. But again, it's a very complicated situation. Just like the LNG tanker, I have to be really careful in looking at how I support renewables and what projects are good or bad for the economy and for decarbonization.
Oh, yeah. We've got to decarbonize, but it can only be done with nuclear in the forefront. In fact, the IPCC has called for a tripling to quadrupling of nuclear power in their 2014 report as being a necessity.
Gabe, since you mentioned the IPCC, I want to share something. This is my little box that has my Ecomodernist Society kit that I bring to every meeting. And we were having them on the second Tuesday of the month at this bar not too far from where I live called Deluxe. And so here we have the IPCC special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. It's that 12 years report. And if I turn all the way to page 16, there it is. Here are the pathways for all of our energy transition plans straight from the IPCC. There will be this point where we need nuclear in every one of these strategies. There's strategy 1 through 4, and every one of those strategies has nuclear.
Wow, that's interesting, because I've read in Grist that the scientists at the IPCC have come up with 91 solutions, I believe, to decarbonize, and none of them were feasible without nuclear power. I mean, what's with the 4?
Those 4 strategies are like, those take all of the features that the scenarios had in common, and they boil them down to these just 4 broad categories of, well, what could we do and what looks like it's going to work in conjunction and support each other. And was it your podcast or someone else's who talked to one of the authors that worked on how these energy systems synergize with one each other, how all of these transition plans either do or don't work in each other's favor? It's on page 22 is where the breakdown of the synergies between all of these plans, like eliminating poverty, like what are the trade-offs and synergies for each of these. And so there's all the categories of actions we can take, the size of them, and how much they support each other are. And that's really fascinating. And I think more people need to get involved in actually looking at this, because there was a lot of work that went into really boiling down the science into a concise document.
Yeah, but it's not as easy as people think. People think it's just a matter of convincing people to support nuclear. But the fact is, there simply cannot be a nuclear renaissance without a massive government-led build-out. Without it, you don't have the economies of scale, you don't have the skilled workforce, you don't have the supply chains. It just becomes too expensive, and it looks like a boondoggle, though it really isn't. And I'm not saying that we need to have a totally planned economy here, but simply ill-suited for the private sector because of the economic rewards. They're so long-term as to be longer than the actual useful life of the investor.
We don't need a planned economy, but we do need a planned society. We need sort of constraints for how society is going to develop, how we're going to react to these existential threats, and that can put bounds on our economy without totally planning it.
So Karl, tell us about the Ecomodernist Society that you formed in Seattle.
Let me do a really quick promo of the Seattle Ecomodernist Society. Before the coronavirus, we were having meetups on the second Tuesday of the month at Deluxe, and I've got my electric bike. I'm ready to bike all over this town 2 or 3 times a month to meet anyone who's interested in forming a futurist environmental pro-science coalition. We support nuclear energy. We support GMOs and sustainable farming. We support medicine and vaccinations. And we really need to work together to achieve that Star Trek future that we all hope for. And so check us out on Facebook, check us out on Meetup, and I hope to meet you. I really hope to get involved and build this coalition for our brighter future.
Well, we want to thank you, Karl, very much. I mean, you've done great work. You're the man. Yeah.
Thanks. And one more thing. If you're watching this live on Your Environment Seattle, please check out Gabe Ignetti's channel on YouTube, the Ecomodernist Soapbox, and check out Ecomodernist Podcast on Apple or on Stitcher or whatever podcast application you're using.
Well, thanks for the promo. That's something I should have did myself. Well, we want to thank you, Karl, very much. I mean, you've done great work. You're the man. Yeah. And we'd like to thank all of our people who are tuned in. Please be careful, stay healthy, and we will see you till next time.